You're listening to QCast, presented by Qcella Media. Please consider giving generously to Qcella's nonprofit mission. To find out more about our mission and to make a donation, visit our website at qcast.qcella.org. Your tax-deductible donation will help us continue bringing you quality podcasts just like this one.
I may be bruised, but I'm not broken. You can't take away my soul. You tried to tell me I don't count, but I know in my heart that's not true. So you cannot take me down that path. I'll make it without you. I may be bruised, but I'm not broken. My life counts for something, and you wake up and I'll be gone. You'll know that you were wrong. Welcome to my show, Shades of Gender. I'm your host, Terry Ryan. Each show will be talking about gender identity, including transgender, cross-dressers, non-binary, gender individuals who self-identify with these groups, and everything in between. The definitions of these groups are often misused and certainly misunderstood. Our goal is to identify these groups, listen to their stories and their journeys in life to get a better understanding of who they are and how they're doing. You can find out about my story in the first podcast. Just generally, I was married to an individual who was self-identified as really nothing, but he liked to wear women's clothing and had a femme role. And we were together for 5 or 6 years, and you can hear more about that story again on the first podcast. But today, I'm very, very happy to have a wonderful human being that I met, and her name is Allison Lenore Annalora. Welcome, Allison.
Thank you for having me.
And don't let me forget later to talk about your book, but there's so much in this book. Allison wrote a book called My Gender Journey, but we want to get to know Allison first before we promote her book. So you can decide whether you like her or not. If you don't like her, you don't want to buy her book, but I think you will. So we've got a lot of questions. And, again, for those new to this podcast is Shades of Gender. It has been, I created it because I wanted the voices of the people in the community to be heard and not to create labels and categories. So what you're going to hear is a lot of different individuals that, how they self-define and what they're doing and what they're up to in their life and their stories. And so again, I believe that we're not just labels in our society, that we're people. And behind that label is a person that deserves respect and deserves to be happy and to be their authentic self, which is my cue that I've learned from being in this community since 2013 is over and over again that the people I've spoke to with gender identity issues were talking about being their authentic self. And I think that's probably one of the most powerful terms that I've run into along the way. So again, welcome. And so, I have to ask you first, because this is just to we talk about not putting labels on, and yet I open up with a label.
That's all right. We have to define it somehow.
Yeah, somehow. So I wanted just for our audience to get an idea of, so how do you identify in the gender scale?
Well, I'm labeled as transgender, but I self-identify as a heterosexual woman who was born with a birth defect, which I had corrected in October of 2010.
So that was
9 years ago.
Wow, 9 years ago. Wow.
Yes, happy anniversary.
Happy anniversary. Finally. But along those lines, and again, you have a story of transformation that wasn't that started early, and I think what we'll go into a little bit, because yours is a very interesting story, and it's got many layers of development that you've gone through. So I think well, first of all, just talk about when did you first self-identify as being a heterosexual little girl?
Around the age of 3, I just assumed I was a girl.
Where did you grow up?
I grew up in a little town called Alderwood Manor, Washington. It's not even there anymore. It got gobbled up by the next town called Linwood. But it was a very small town. Everybody knew everybody. My grandparents were well known because they owned the only furniture store in town.
I bet. How big was this town? Like 5,000 people, maybe?
Probably, yeah.
Small.
And my adoptive parents ran a butcher shop. My father was the meat cutter and my mother was the meat wrapper. I was adopted as a newborn. So
you really didn't know anything about, at that point,
I
you
had
didn't even
no
know
idea.
you were adopted, right? Till later, which I think
much
you bring
later,
out in your
right.
book.
And so at 3 or 4, my father was not tolerant of it at all, though my grandmother and my mother kind of indulged it a little bit, thinking it was a phase.
To dress and
To play with dolls and put my mother and my grandmother's makeup on. I love their red lipstick and put on their high heels and run around the house like that and spin and twirl. And
you were what? You said about 3 or 4?
3 or 4.
So very
and
young.
then when I got into kindergarten, my kindergarten teacher had a parent-teacher conference with my adoptive parents who were already starting to worry about this phase lasting too long already. And the teacher said, "You've got to do something about your child because he keeps telling everybody he's a little girl and it's upsetting to the other children." So my parents told me that if I didn't stop telling people I was a girl, they were going to put me in a mental institution with the other crazy people. So I went on the down low, as they say, but luckily my grandmother let me play dolls and play dress up at her house. So guess where I wanted to be all the time?
At your grandma's house. It wasn't her cookies. I used to go there for chicken soup, but you went there for the dolls and to be who you were, which is a little girl. You know, this is something that struck me when I was reading your book about you announcing that you were a little girl. Was that because you were, again, because that's what you felt you were, and the world, you were trying to rebel that, no, I'm not the boy that you see here?
Yes, because I really didn't, a child doesn't really know that much about genitalia. I didn't even know what it looked like until, when I was a little older and accidentally saw my parents.
Horrible. That's always the worst.
Yes, it's like,
I don't
oh my
know.
God.
It's the worst thing you can do as a child to see your parents in the act. It's like,
it's terrible.
talk about a nightmare.
Yes,
it lasts
I've
forever.
never gotten over it.
No, me either. Never.
So it was just, I identified with everything female. I'd watch TV or movies on TV, or I remember I had a pair of red corduroy pants and my mother had a pair of red capris, and I just identified that I too had red capris, and I wore those poor things out because it was my way of expressing myself. But of course, as I got older, that was frowned upon. I got slapped in the face and treated horribly because they had lost patience with me. They didn't know what to do. They weren't equipped to raise a child like me.
Well, you're in a small town. You're back in, what was it, the late 50s, early 60s.
Right.
Working class family.
Right.
Small town.
Blue collar.
And, they probably, the gay was difficult for them.
My father
no
referred to them as queers.
Oh, they were, okay. I think it's coming back now, though.
Yeah. Now it's a good term, but back then it was not.
I know. They're taking it back and redefining it.
Which is good, because then it takes the power away from it.
It does. It sure does. So when you were... So it obviously wasn't just cross-dressing. It was you said something I thought that was very interesting, is that as a child, we're not really thinking about genitalia. So you're just kind of being who you are. And I think that part of this movement, that I've got this, my own opinion with children, that to allow children to be who they are, and to let them, you were self-identifying at a young age. And I don't know, in your, experience with the transgender community, have you found that some of your colleagues or other people in your community that were self-identifying as a woman early or little girl early on?
Everyone I know and every book I've ever read by people who have transitioned at some point in their lives, many early, had always self-identified as soon as they could see there was a difference between the two, just in, general clothes and gestures and energy, feminine energy, masculine energy. It's very, very common, which is why I'm a big proponent of allowing children. They say if it's a phase, then one day they'll say, oh, I think I want to be a boy or I want to be a girl, whatever. And then the next day they're out doing something with their peer group that is very typical of their gender. When it becomes persistent and it dominates their every thought and emotion, then you need to take the child to a professional because they're most likely on the spectrum, whatever that spectrum may be.
I appreciate your comment on that because I think that's a very sensible but supportive comment.
Right.
Because children are children.
Right.
And children do play.
They do.
And if you come in too early and take every child that says I'm just a girl, that doesn't necessarily mean that they are.
No, they're just learning about the world.
Right, about the world. So, but on the flip side, not to ignore it if it becomes something that's persistent, that's interfering with their ability to socialize with other children, to fit into society, that it is becoming something as they're growing and they're not self-identifying with the opposite gender.
Right.
Which is, I think, quite responsible. So how do you feel then, you say to going along this topic on self-identifying as the opposite gender and then it being persistent, are you a believer then in stopping hormones at a certain point?
I am. I'm a big fan of Jazz Jennings. I thought her parents handled it beautifully, as I am of Hillary Whittington, whose child was born not only hearing impaired but female, and after she got cochlear implants, the first thing she said is, I'm not a girl, I'm a boy. And they were a very conservative religious family, but they did the right thing. They took their child to the experts, and now he's a happy 12-year-old boy.
Oh, that's wonderful. Those are, it's case-to-case basis, I guess. I think
but it's
that's
about the persistence.
Right. That's what I'm trying to get to.
It's about the persistence. If they persist, I cried, I carried on. That's why I got my face slapped, because I just didn't want to hear what I had to say.
And great, from what I can see in reading your book, really with great, adversity from your peers. You ostracized yourself over and over again because of your wanting to be your authentic self and saying, listen to me, this is not who I am. And I want to be treated as a girl because I'm a girl.
Exactly.
And don't look at me as a boy because I'm a girl. And I think there was as time went on and the Beatles came out, who you said you loved.
Yes.
And I remember you saying, well, because, back then it was, you must be gay then, because, they didn't even talk about, they didn't talk about gender issues.
I didn't know, yeah.
Yeah, what am I? I must be gay. There weren't a lot of, Renee Richards was one of the early ones, right?
Right. Well, the one that I focused on was Christine Jorgensen. I saw her on the cover of the Police Gazette, along with two entertainers from Le Carousel in Paris who had transitioned in the 50s. And it said, these blonde bombshells used to be men. Well, I was 10 years old, and I saw that cover, and I started to read it, and a store clerk came up behind me and said, you can't look at that. That's trash. You're too young for that. So knowing that I had to know how these people who were in the same situation as me, first off, that I'm not the only one and that they had done something about it. So I circled around like a vulture until no one was looking, and then I shoplifted it and ran home and read it over and over and over and again. Now, I'm not advocating shoplifting.
Right, that's good. That's a good
in desperate times and desperate measures.
Right, so you got it out without getting caught, which I thought was, quite good.
Yes.
Your early days of hiding and being able to get away with things,
yes.
right?
So I read it from cover to cover, and then I found out that Christine Jorgensen had done it in 1952 and had become quite a celebrity because a friend of the family outed her to the New York Post. And so paparazzi was invented back then when she got off the plane, and she was just surrounded by media. But she wrote an autobiography, and so when I was about 14, I read it, and it emboldened me to tell my parents. So simultaneously in the summer of '69, when everything else happened, I read that book. I found out the University of Washington was beginning a gender, well, they called it sex change back then.
Right.
And called them transsexuals.
They sure did.
So I, armed with all of my research material, told my parents, who were both alcoholics, that I wanted to transition as female. And of course, it didn't go well. I tried to commit suicide. And
how old were you when you did this?
14.
So you tried to commit suicide at 14 after your conversation with your parents?
Right, and they said, well, if that's the way you feel, we'll take you down to San Francisco with all the other fruits and fairs.
So they were just ready to just drop you there, and there was no acceptance of any?
None at all. So I tried to commit suicide. Of course, that scared them, and then it sent me to a psychiatrist who joyously and out of character for the times was on my side.
Well, actually, it was a lifesaver probably to
It
go
was.
to
It
that
saved my
psychiatrist,
life.
wasn't it? It saved your life, yeah.
Saved my life.
Because what it, I'm sure, did is give you, because you had a dysfunctional, outside of the fact that you
Right.
were a little girl, you in a boy's body, you were with parents who certainly were dysfunctional in a relationship. So seeing the psychiatrist probably gave you some exposure to some independent, neutral party that wasn't judgmental.
Oh, it was wonderful.
Do you remember his name?
Dr. Alan Twan.
Yeah, so you never forget those, do you?
No.
Years later.
And I wished that I'd had the wherewithal to look him up and tell him that he saved my life, because he did. But he was probably in his late 50s, early 60s when I was 14. So by the time I had the maturity to understand what he had done for me, it was too late.
Yeah, I'm
but
sorry.
wherever you are,
Oh.
thank you.
And he's probably watching down on you.
I'm sure he
Yeah,
is.
I mean, we remember. I well, for another reason, but yeah, we've all had people along the way that gave us in the midst of chaos to have a professional, psychiatrist or a social worker or someone who took the time to give us some clarity and to say that we counted. That that it wasn't you're not responsible for all these bad things happening, that
Right.
you're just trying to be you, and that you're in an abusive environment. So
That's exactly what he said. Yes.
yeah, and that you just need to continue. So the role models were slim back in the 1950s,
Slim
60s,
pickings,
slim
yes.
pickings, but there were some.
There were, because
So
they
just look at what you had. You now could say, well, what am I? Am I an alien? Well, I mean, why is everyone calling me a little boy when I'm a little girl?
Right.
There's no one out here. I think you said in your book, am I the only one that's out here? It's like, what am I, from another world?
Yeah, I had no idea. I
Right.
do know that every night I'd pray to God that I'd wake up the next morning a little girl, and of course every morning I was disappointed.
Oh, well, God can
that-
only work so much.
Yeah, I know.
I mean, he couldn't snap his finger and just...
So I
just
learned
be-
now it's just a journey that, we all have our journey to learn about life, compassion, and self-knowledge.
So let me continue on this. You didn't have any siblings, right?
No, I did not. I was the only child.
Sounds like on that dysfunctional background is probably a good thing.
Yes.
There's a lot to cover on that, but we'll do that another time.
Well, they can read the book.
Yeah, exactly. So because you really after 14 and you made it. I'm sure you probably did a reset on how to present yourself in order to better be part of society, because the role models weren't right next to you. You could see it, but you weren't sure, right? So how did you then go forward as you got older?
Well, I told a lot of my friends, but a lot of the people that I hung out with in high school were all misfits in some way anyway. So they were very accepting of me because I was very accepting of them. At 17, my adoptive father passed away, and my adoptive mother begrudgingly said that she would help me, though she, said things like, the first time somebody says, "Oh, see that woman over there, she used to be a man," she says, "you're going to go blow your brains out." Well, with that kind of support, you start freaking out. So I started the transition. And then in those days, you had to go stealth, as we call it, because society didn't accept it at all. So you had to leave everybody behind that you ever knew and ever loved and start all over again and create a past that never existed, and hope like hell that nobody ever figured it out.
Oh my goodness. It's still hiding in the closet.
Right.
Yeah.
So it was another closet. So I decided, okay, I'm going to live my life as a gay man and do drag, because that satisfied part of the need.
So you were forced really then to, you said, that's even more isolated. Like you finally found, as you got, it sounds like in high school, you found your way and found some misfits, as you said, but that people that supported each other, which in life, it doesn't, as long as we have a group, then we don't feel all alone, because that's what happens.
And I had friends along the way.
Right.
Who supported me. But the general consensus in both the LGBT community,
back then,
right. Community as well as the straight community were not supportive.
Right. Well, it's,
because it was mind-boggling to them, and all they knew is that I was going to make them feel uncomfortable.
Well,
because I was doing something they didn't understand.
And I think there was also the definition back then. It was transsexual. I mean, everyone likes to glamorize the word transgender, but the reality, it was transsexual.
Right.
It was, I know there was...
Renee Richards.
Right. I mean, it was a total different kind of image as we look at today. It was, the poor, the community, they were getting beat up on the streets. I know there were case in point, I think there were African-American...
mostly women, trans women of color.
Trans women of color that were on the street, that were getting beat up, and basically, people like to beat up people that were transsexual.
Right.
That's what they did. I mean, it's hard to believe today. It's like, what? I mean, I'm sure some of this happened in the gay community too, but I mean, it was like unbelievable how bad rap it went. Right. You had to in order to protect yourself. And that, today we say, one of my friends who's transgender said, be safe. But we're talking today, it's certainly be safe. But back in the 40s and 50s and 60s, and be safe. I mean, we're not talking be safe, be alive.
Yeah.
Because they would come in and beat the crap out of you.
Oh, yeah.
Because you would, for some reason, it threatened them to their core of identity. And then, of course, you had the transvestites, which were... in the UK, very popular. I mean, there a lot of TV was based, but not really violent. It was like, oh, that's okay. You can dress up as a woman.
As long as I know you're a man.
As long as I know you're a man. That's right.
Right.
What really bothered, I think, on an instinctive level, and it still is a challenge for some people, many people today, in all communities. First of all, the lack of understanding of the shades of gender.
Right.
The distinction between kind of that a transgender, cross-dressing, gender questioning, gender, just all about gender, or that spectrum without the labels, that there probably are, we need to reclassify, but with heavy labels, in the sense of look at that there are some similarities probably within each of these groups.
Yes.
But the labels still get caught up. And it doesn't mean that one group is better than the other. What I've always resented, I think, a bit, is that when I was dealing with the trans and the transgender and the cross-dressers. And I first met through this community, through Trias, through the cross-dressing community. But within that room were trans women.
Uh-huh.
I mean, they might have not had their reassignment surgery, but they were still trying to figure out.
Right.
You know, you have to, and again, they didn't have the leisure of today where a young trans woman or man has role models. They have people that have come out. It's they have the modeling.
They have the medical.
They have the medical support. They've got also a cool factor in some ways with the modeling agencies that are hiring trans models.
Right.
Because there's modeling agencies, of course, that jump on that because it's androgynous. It's looking cool. But it doesn't stop. There's still a lot of work to be done within.
Oh, most definitely.
And most definitely, you're still a lot of angst. We have a long way. We're just at the beginning of. We're just starting to talk about it.
Yes.
So change doesn't happen until we can talk and we can feel comfortable within the community and begin to look at people as people and remove the abuse and the prejudice. And I found from the whole gender identity issue, and I found a lot of my gay friends were as clueless as my straight friends.
Oh, very definitely. I had a friend I'd known since I was 18, and he's a psychologist, if you can believe, and he has known all of this time that I was transgender, yet when I did transition, he said to me, well, at least I don't have to defend you behind your back anymore. He said all of our friends used to say, oh my God, he's so femmy. Why doesn't he just cut it off and get it over with? And now you have.
Oh, geez.
That was the last time we spoke.
You betcha. You said, but this is, again, it's the insensitivity of as I said, the straight, the gay, the community. There's still a tremendous insensitivity of the gender identity. And I will say that some of my closer friends would sit me down when I first did the documentary and started getting into the trans and the cross-dressing gender issues back in 2013. And my closer friends that were gay would sit down with me and say, can you tell us what you're experiencing, and can you educate? Can you tell us? So there's a lot of work to be done, and
that's because people assume that gender identity and sexual orientation are the same things.
Right. That's exactly true.
That's the assumption that people need to let go of, because there's as many in my community that identify as heterosexual women after their transition as there are that identify as lesbian. Mm-hmm. And so we need to know that those two things are completely separate issues, which is why the gay community sometimes has issue with the trans community, only because they don't understand, because the gay men like being men, they just are attracted to men, and the women enjoy being women, they're just attracted to women. So, and I think that there's a fear on their part of getting labeled, because people make those assumptions.
Right.
Well, if you're gay, you must want to be a woman, or if you're lesbian, you must want to be a man, which is ludicrous. And again, this is why you have the show Shades of Gender, to let everybody know that everybody is different. I mean, I see the shades of masculinity and femininity among the straight community, or
that's right.
Like science likes to call them cisgender.
I know.
Which means they're
I
in
didn't know
harmony
I was
with
a
their...
cisgender until I was like 50.
I only recently heard of it myself.
I mean, anyway. Well, we're gonna have to wrap up this particular podcast. I'd love to have you back.
I would love to be back.
You promise me you'll come back?
I promise.
So much to talk about. Okay.
Yes.
And then why don't you tell us your name of your book and how to find it?
Okay, the name of my book is Late Blooming, My Gender Journey by Allison, Lenore, Anna Laura, and you can get it as a Kindle or a paperback at Amazon.com. I also is selling autographed copies at Just Fabulous in downtown Palm Springs, but I'm not sure if they have any copies left, but be sure and check.
Wonderful. It's one of my favorite stores. Just fabulous. Isn't it great?
It is great.
Yeah,
I
it
love
is good.
Stephen. He's been a good friend.
It's the best. So, well, what we do love about Palm Springs is they try out here. We try to be open, and we try.
The diversity. Well, that's what helped me transition after I moved from Seattle, is moving to a place where there was diversity.
It really does. It does make it special, because it is one of the few places, I think, in the country that allows at least the dialogue. So we're happy to be here, and we will be back again soon with our third podcast. And I hope you come back to listen as we discuss shades of gender. I'm Terry Ryan, your host, and thank you for joining me today. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Free, bruised, but I'm not